Good morning. How are you today? I hope you're well. We have reached in our thinking 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, this is a wonderful chapter. This is a glorious chapter. Oh, it's all about the resurrection to begin with, and then about the second coming. And I have this picture in my mind as I've been thinking about 1 Corinthians 15 and this letter in general, that we know, we thought about it earlier on, it's mentioned in one of the verses earlier on, that he was replying to a letter that they had sent to him. Now he had visited Corinth twice and spent a lot of time with them. He'd established this church, and there was obviously a previous letter that he had written, which we don't have, but we have what for us is 2 Corinthians, which we'll be going on to. So there was a lot of correspondence between him and this church, and it's quite evident from what we've been looking at the rest of the book, the letter, that he was answering questions and dealing with difficulties they had, problems they had, and they wanted his thinking on these things, his advice. And I can imagine him sitting there having dealt with all the issues about how to conduct yourself in worship and how the church should be run and where prophecy fitted in and where tongues fitted in, and all these questions that they had, that he's reached the end of that, concluding with this phrase, so all things should be done decently and in order. And he's finished that, and I imagine him thinking, now what else did they write to me and ask about? And what this chapter 15 seems to cover the big burning question that the Christians in Corinth had about life and death. Now, think about the life of Jesus. The life of Jesus had covered 33 and a half years about to the crucifixion. The resurrection had happened 3 days later, on the third day, and then 40 days later, the ascension happened. And when he ascended, and during his time on earth, he had told them he was coming back. Even the angels or the young men that were there at the ascension said, why are you looking into heaven? He's going to come back. Now, so everything in the life of Jesus had happened within 34 years. And we know that roughly the date for the birth of Jesus is a few years out, maybe a few years out. So roughly the ascension happened in the year 29 or 30 AD. This book was written around about AD 55, 25 years later. Now, just imagine, we're in the 21st year since the millennium. Supposing somebody went away in 1995 and said, bye guys, I'll see you, I'll be back. And here we are, 25 years later, and they haven't come. Jesus hadn't come back. Everything else in the life of Jesus had happened in quick succession. But he hadn't come back. Not only hadn't he come back, but a lot of people had come to faith, and some of them had died. And Jesus hadn't come back. And I think for the early church, this was a really difficult question. Because if you couldn't believe and accept Jesus' word about coming back, how could you believe anything else he said? How could you believe what Paul was saying about Jesus and about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? How could you believe these people? 25 years had passed, and this next event hadn't happened. I can imagine Paul, when he was preaching in Corinth, saying, "Come to faith, come quickly, come to faith. There's an urgency because Jesus is coming back." And you may not get another opportunity. I think maybe there was an urgency to the early church preaching that we don't have today, because we're used to the idea that Jesus has tarried, has not come for 2,000 years. And so why would you expect him to come today or tomorrow? And it's very difficult to maintain an expectation that Jesus is coming back when he's delayed so long. And it must have put into doubt all the other things that Paul had taught them about the life of Jesus. Did these things really happen? And so the first few verses, up to verse 8, really from verse 3 to verse 8, is Paul recounting very briefly the life of Jesus. This is so important. Don't lose sight of this. Don't lose your grip on these truths, that Jesus died according to the scriptures. He was buried, was raised again according to the scriptures. He appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12. And that's quite interesting because we know in the Gospels it says when they were gathered in the upper room, and the two that had gone to Emmaus came back and reported that they'd seen Jesus, and the disciples said, "Oh, yes, he's appeared to the women and to Peter." So that had happened on that resurrection day. Then he'd appeared to the 12. Then he'd appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So some of those people who'd actually witnessed Jesus in his resurrection body had already died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me. Now, a lot of these appearances we don't have a record of. We don't have a record except a report of the appearance to Peter. We don't have a record of the appearance of Jesus to 500 people at one time. I wonder where that was. Was that up in Galilee, where most of his followers were? Where he'd ministered so much? I don't know. We don't know. We don't have a record of it. He appeared to James. We don't have a record of his appearance to James as a one-off appearance. But these were all. And then he says he appeared to me, and that was his conversion on the road to Emmaus. No, on the road to Damascus. On the road to Damascus. So just think about it. Just think about these extra appearances of Jesus. But think too about the problem it produced for the early church, who had all expected Jesus to arrive while they were alive and to return, because everything else had happened in such quick succession. It had produced a real problem. And Paul uses this wonderful chapter in 1 Corinthians to talk about the resurrection and the return of Jesus and everything that happens as a consequence of that. It is, without that question being asked, we wouldn't have all this information from this wonderful chapter. So tighten your seatbelts. We're in for a great ride as we look at 1 Corinthians 15 together. God bless you. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.